Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 80 of WP Roundtable. My name is Jason Crawford, coming to you from Medellin, Colombia. And today we have a very special guest with us, coming to us from Tin Up. He has got just a world of experience, Mr. John Eckman. John, would you like to introduce yourself?
You bet. So, as Jason said, I'm John Eckman. I'm currently the CEO at Tin Up and have been a long-time WordPress user, developer, evangelist, WordCamp organizer, attendee, speaker, general WordPress person for the last 10 years. I'm very happy to be on the show tonight.
Excellent. And I think we're going to be asking John, I guess it's just me tonight, by the way, Kyle and Mark.
Is that the royal we?
Yeah, apparently it's habitual, I guess. Mark is not going to make it, and Kyle may or may not show up late, but he got stuck at a train somewhere. And so for those viewers who are wondering why there's not a round table and just like a little tiny slim one with the two of us, that's what's going on.
It's more of a bistro table tonight.
Yep. But we also have the opportunity, with all this extra time, we're going to ask John things that aren't WordPress related because we're always getting questions about how when would you not use WordPress, and none of us, as far as the panel and most of our guests, have not been able to give us some good answers. But John's been huge in not just the WordPress community, but Drupal and various others. But so hopefully we'll be able to pick his brain about that tonight.
Sure.
And I guess for now I'll use we as in we, the viewers, the audience.
Yes.
All right, so let's get started. I'm going to blow past the picks of the week unless you've got one.
I did have one, just because I was prepared. I've seen the show before, so I did have one, which is it's a plugin I haven't actually used yet, but it actually speaks to some of what you were talking about, like when would you not use WordPress. So one of the things that I've talked about at a number of places is kind of content personalization and contextual changes to web presentation, which is something that a lot of other content platforms have focused on and not so much in the WordPress community. It's been possible for a long time, but it's not been the foreground. And there's a plugin by Duda called Insight, I-N-S-I-T-E. It's insight.io if you want to check it out. And it is kind of, you define a trigger, you define a condition and a trigger, and then it takes some action. So if a visitor visits your site for the 5th time, then show them the subscribe to the newsletter banner. If they, have visited a certain number of pages in one category, then show them different recommendations than you would otherwise. So it kind of looks like a very effective, simple personalization engine. I just met the team behind it at WordCamp New York. So that was only a couple of weeks ago. I haven't had time to sort of install it on a sample box and try it out, but it looks really interesting to me.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, my pick of the week was just going to be that we've finally gotten a WP meetup here in Medellin. So all those people who have been waiting for us to get a WordCamp so that they've got an excuse to come visit beautiful Colombia instead of, and have a real good excuse for that. It may be coming sooner than 10 years down the line as I once expected.
That's great. Is that a meetup that happens in Spanish or in English, or is it?
We just had the first one maybe a week or so ago, and it was quite bilingual, I'd say.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think future presentations we're going to do in Spanish, as most people here are going to speak Spanish.
That's cool. That's great.
So a little bit about your beginnings. You did I just want to do a shout out real quick. You did an episode with the Dragcast, and you talked about getting into Tin Up and your entire career up to that point. So we'll skip all of that for the most part, but like real early on, where did you grow up and how did you grow up?
Oh boy, we're going to go with the deep cuts tonight. So I was born in northern Minnesota. I was born in Duluth, in the same hospital Bob Dylan was born in, though not in the same year. And I grew up kind of split between Minnesota and Colorado. So I grew up just outside Aspen, and my mother was a school teacher in the Aspen public schools for many years. And then high school was kind of the Minneapolis area. So I graduated from Richfield High School in Minneapolis, and then from there went out to Boston for undergraduate, and then out to Seattle, Washington on the other side of the country for graduate school. And then moved back to Boston kind of in 2000 after getting my PhD and moving, deciding to move back into the web industry.
And just because Kyle likes to know, what did you want to be when you were a kid?
You know, it's funny. I really don't know all the way back to being a kid. I think there was a time when I probably would have had, race car driver and astronaut in that list, right? I'm young enough that I remember going to see the first Star Wars when it came out in the theater, right? Kind of in the late 70s, as a very young kid. So probably something around either race car driving or space exploration would have been on that list. In college, I think I thought I was going to be a novelist, or hanging out in the Czech Republic writing poetry in cafes or something, but that proved not to be. Instead, I write code now. But
as they say, code is poetry.
It is. I'm a big fan of the whole code is poetry concept.
All right. Well, so you missed out on the Czech Republic, but otherwise you're sticking with poetry.
Yeah.
All right, and like I said, you did a lot with the Dragcast, so I'm just gonna point people in that direction to your college years and how you worked your way up. But so let's go ahead and jump right into 10 Up. What are your responsibilities as the CEO?
So 10 Up, is a wonderful and fantastic company, and obviously Jake gets a lot of credit for doing a lot of things right in the first couple of years and continuing to do a lot of things right. And one of those things, I think, is sort of recognizing where there's a need to bring more people onto the team with specific skill sets or with specific areas of focus that either aren't his or can't continue to be his, right? In order to scale, you need to start to kind of step out of different parts of the business. So when Jake and I first started talking about me joining the team at 10 Up, we talked about a lot of kind of different areas where I might provide a complement to his skills. For one, my background is a bit more varied in terms of kind of user experience and visual design and sort of working with more design-centric agencies. So that was a nice kind of overlap with 10 Up's core engineering strength. And then I'm more, I guess my background is more in larger agencies. So thinking about processes, thinking about operations, thinking about scale and what it means to think about strategy for a 100-person company or a 200-person company or a 500-person company was sort of more where I had experience. So a lot of what I do is, I like to say that Jake focuses more on inbound, on sort of new account relationships and on our external presence. And I focus more on kind of execution and culture and sort of how projects get delivered over time. So a lot of that's operational, things like invoicing systems and accounting and HR policies and some of that kind of stuff that a lot of entrepreneurs get bored by, as well as it's convenient being on the East Coast, taking on kind of account management responsibilities for some of our key accounts on the East Coast, being able to get from Boston down to DC pretty easily and everything in between means that I can take on some of those relationships. And then I work with the rest of our executive team. So Jess Jurek and Vaskin Howry, who some people will know from the WordPress community from speaking at WordCamps or other involvement. Jess focuses more on our client delivery team, so managing the team leads and sort of being responsible for production management of the day-to-day. And Vaskin heads up the whole engineering organization. So the four of us really just try to operate as servant leaders to the employees and make sure that everybody's got what they need to be successful on their projects, and try to make sure that we're continuing over time to get smarter. I'm a big believer in kind of, it's okay to make mistakes as long as you're not making the same ones over and over again. So trying to take those opportunities to say, oh, there's something that's not working. What's a solution to it that's not just going to fix it for now, but is actually going to yield long-term results? It's a long answer to a very short question. A little of everything, right? CEOs wears lots of hats. Our job is to catch everything that gets escalated up from the team or falls through the cracks and try to make sure that it gets properly taken care of. So sometimes that means reviewing contracts for legal terms. Sometimes it means jumping in with a project team to try to find a smarter strategy for dealing with the problem. Sometimes it means mentoring and coaching other managers in the organization to make them more effective. Sometimes it means staying up late one night sending invoices to make sure all the bills get out on time. It's really just whatever needs to happen.
Nice. So what would you say some of your favorite parts of your job are?
Well, I'm a huge fan of working with employees. So, in my first career, as I talked about a bit on broadcast, I was a teacher and sort of worked in academia. And one of the core things that you learn about teaching is that it's less about the specific skills that you're implementing, and as much as it is about kind of the attitude that people have. And it's showing people how they really can solve their own problems. It's teaching them how to learn. It's teaching them how to investigate and troubleshoot and debug and figure out their own solution. And so I love working with teams to sort of figure out, how can we solve this ourselves? How can we get over this problem? I love working with our accounts. I think that kind of opportunity to solve a problem for a client and see their excitement at the solution, either when you first kind of describe how it's going to work, or even at the end when you've delivered and your post-launch day. Those are the things that are sort of most exciting.
And we've got to ask, which parts?
What are the parts that suck? Yeah. It's surprising. I mean, it's kind of sounds like a cliche answer, but that's actually harder to answer because I really love my job. I'm a person who believes in really leaning in hard to work, and I work a lot of hours, but it's great because I enjoy it. I love everything that I do. I think if there's a hard part, it's parting ways with employees for whom it's not working out. I think it was Mitt Romney in the last election cycle who said he really liked firing people. I really don't like firing people. That's really the least favorite part of my job. There are going to be times when, for whatever reason, an employee doesn't work out, or either mutually or by our decision, we're going to part ways. Those are hard conversations. I think having hard conversations with clients about the mismatch between budget and expectations, either with prospects or with current clients, those are hard conversations, because I would love to be able to just wave my magic wand and say budget is never an issue and we don't even have to talk about money and we're just going to build some cool stuff together. But of course, that's not really how a business works. So, sometimes you've got to have those conversations, and those are tough. I mean, I think, I always feel like we're doing the best we can to do right by the client. So they're good conversations, but they can be hard.
No, I definitely feel that one. That's a tough one for me as well. Yeah. I usually cave in. I've really got to work on not caving in.
Exactly. Especially that's the long-term sustainability thing, right? Ultimately, I'm a big believer that to a large extent, we teach people how to treat us, and that is true of our employers and our clients. And if we consistently fail to defend the value of what we're doing, then we can't really be mad at them for not seeing it, right? So that standing up for the right solution, even if sometimes, and there's always lots of good solutions at different budgets, right? It's just like buying a car or whatever. There's a great entry-level car, or there's a luxury car, and there's a couple in between, and they're all good solutions to the problem. It's a question of which one fits what you're trying to do. And so it's never just a no, what you want can't be done. It's always a question of sort of which of these options make sense for you.
All right, that's a good point. I'll keep that in mind. What would you describe as the typical or ideal customer client?
An ideal customer for 10up, you mean? Yeah. So we tend to work with customers who either are in the media and publishing space, so they're making money off of content production, either directly or indirectly, or I like to say brands who act like them. So whether that's consumer brands or high-tech brands, or even like universities or NGOs or whatever, nonprofits. It's people who have a large volume of content to publish and a kind of digital-centric experience, who are either selected WordPress as their platform or are open to a conversation about WordPress as their platform. And ideally, they come to us early enough that there's still a lot of opportunity to help shape the project. Sometimes clients will come to us with fairly well-realized project plans, kind of designs and feature sets and sort of a pretty clear sense of what it is that they want built. We can do those projects, and they can be great projects because you can really build some compelling stuff. But I prefer the sort of clients where we can have a bit more of that early conversation and help shape the requirements in a way that is going to contribute to a better user experience or a better author experience. I think people are good clients for 10up if they think about digital publishing as strategic to their business. It's not some ancillary thing like our real business is we sell widgets over here, but by the way, we have to have a website, and it's not really that important to them. As opposed to, a client, Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, JDRF.org is a client, and their site is a critical way for them to communicate to people in the general population with diabetes, as well as people who might be potential fundraisers or supporters or politicians they're trying to influence. Like, communication is a critical part of what they do, so it's strategic to them, and they think about it that way. Those are folks we really like to see.
Nice. Well, I actually got a pre-question about employees there, and I kind of deferred that onto our interview with Jake Goldman. That was, I think, episode number 50.
Yep.
But it did kind of spin it into a conversation that might be relevant. I think a great question for you.
Yeah.
So with relation to yourselves, 10up is distributed across the United States, correct?
We're actually technically globally distributed. So about 100 of our employees are in the US and the rest are international.
Oh, excellent.
So we have a significant presence, and that's not a precise number, but just a rough figure. We have a bunch in Canada, but then we have people scattered South Africa, India, Germany, France, the UK, Mexico, Brazil. I don't think we have anybody in Colombia, but we have broken into South America at some level. Philippines we added recently. So yeah, we're all distributed fully. And sometimes, other folks will say you're a remote company, and I always have to kind of say we're not remote, because that implies there's some center to be remote from, right? We're all equally distributed. It's like a fully distributed network, right? There isn't a server. We're all peers. Or some people will say you're a virtual company, and I always have to say, well, there's nothing virtual about 10up. We're a very real thing, right? So I like to say we're a deliberately globally distributed agency.
Nice. I didn't know that. I thought you guys were still all U.S. specifically. But that's even better, because I was going to reference Automatic, who's also global. And primarily my question is, do you see other niches or industries, because I know you've spoken various times about dealing with these other industries. Do you see any of them that are quite as distributed as what's going on in the WordPress community and digital marketing and whatnot?
Yeah, well, I go back to 2006. I started working with a company called Aptaros, which still exists, so it's in a different form now. Was an agency founded by kind of a management team that came out of Cambridge Technology Partners and Viant, two kind of big technology firms. And their focus was on bringing open source to enterprise IT. And that was a company that started with a global focus from the beginning. So we started here in Boston, but there was also a parallel offshoot that started in Switzerland at the same time. And we had offices all the way from San Francisco, Austin, Texas, New York, Boston, Germany, Switzerland, all the way out to then the Philippines. And the model was open source software, right? So open source software, since even before it was called open source, right, even going back to sort of the earlier days of Unix, was always developed by people who were distributed around the world, right? And worked together in interesting ways. So we kind of said, why can't we do that same thing for projects that we do for clients? Let's just start from day one with the assumption that the project team is going to be global. So we're going to need the equivalent of a chat room. And this was all before HipChat, but similar kind of concept or Slack. We're going to need a place where the team can gather. We're going to need something like Jira where we can put documents and sort of share conversation threads and document our meetings. We're going to need a way to do conferences. So this was pre-video chat, but a good audio conferencing solution was good enough at the time, right? And we're sort of going to need to just always act as though the team is fully distributed. And so I think development is the first and obvious one, because you can write computer code from anywhere, right? As long as you have the right connection. I think we're seeing it also in kind of customer service. I don't know if you've had this happen, but you need to call the company from whom you ordered something to get a return or an RMA or whatever, and you get the sense the person you're talking to is in their bedroom somewhere, maybe in the US, maybe abroad, right? So we see a lot of that kind of work from home in customer service, things that don't require you to have a physical presence. I think I mean, there's some people who would just say this is the future of work and this is how it's going to be for everybody. I don't know that it's going to be that way for everybody, but I wouldn't be at all surprised to see this be 20, 30, 40% of the working population, 50 years from now. Like the need to physically commute into an office just doesn't make sense anymore in most industries, in places where you're not, hands on an assembly line, actually assembling physical products, which very few or a relatively small number of people in the US are doing these days, right? It's more often services. I don't think you're going to get good virtual distributed firms in the services industry in its traditional sense, like waiting tables and, sure, healthcare and all of that. Although there's interesting telemedicine stuff going on too, but, I think you're still going to want to see a doctor in person for the most part. But I think everything else that's so-called knowledge worker work, right, white collar work, I don't see why a great percentage of that can't move into a distributed model. It's funny, every time we come up against, I don't know, some new regulation that happens in one state but not the other states, or every time we talk about, we want to ship somebody a laptop but they're in a country that we don't have a legal presence in, and we got to deal with all the weird regulations that happen. We have to kind of joke and say we're living in a distributed era, right? This is the world of post borders and all that. And yet, of course, we still have to deal with sort of health regulations in different states, and we got to deal with the unemployment differences between different countries. And, there's still a lot of stuff that's very border driven.
That really brings us great into what I wanted to bring up next.
Colombia.
What's that?
You would know, being in Colombia, right? There's sort of companies you deal with in the U.S. that assume you're in the U.S. and aren't willing to ship to places outside the U.S. or aren't willing to,
Oh, I just tell them I'm still in the U.S. and have everything delivered to me by somebody traveling.
Yeah, that's the way to handle it. I mean, it's like, you have an email address. Why does it matter what country you're in? Like, that's not,
Yeah,
shouldn't matter at some level.
No, well, and that can get frustrating. But now that you've brought up open source, I'd like to ask you, how do you think that has, to this point, started to create an effect on society? I mean, talking to CMSs, digital currencies, the Linux operating, or operating systems. What effect do you think that's had up to this point? And then my follow-up question will be, what do you see that coming up with in the future?
See, this is the danger of asking an English major, is you get a bunch of book recommendations. There's a great book called The Penguin and the Leviathan, which is by Yochai Benkler, who's a professor at Yale, used to be at Harvard, very, very smart guy. It's a popularized book, so it's a thin book. It's not a super deep book, but it's about how cooperation will trump competition. And he basically looks at the last 20 years of research in various social sciences and hard sciences, and says this myth that sort of people are driven by competition and by selfish benefits, right? Self-benefit as the primary motivator, and that society sort of works out as long as everybody pursues their own self-interest, is actually not the way that increasingly scientists understand human behavior. It's actually as much, and not just human behavior, but even natural phenomena. There's as much cooperation going on in the natural world as there is competition, and the same is true in humans. And so basically the argument he makes is it's the penguin from Linux, it's the Linux penguin, versus Hobbes's Leviathan from philosophy, which is human life is nasty, brutish, and short, and nature is red and tooth and claw, and it's all about competition. And so that's a fantastic kind of look at how this is changing a lot of industries, and how that kind of model of people who compete but also cooperate at the same time, our relationship with folks like Web Dev Studios and others is one in which we compete together. We compete for certain projects, and yet we collaborate on other things. And it's a very weird kind of thing from a historical business point of view, but it actually works incredibly well in practice. I think that book does a great job of sort of showing some of the impact in other places. I think from a pure just development point of view, if you look at the rise of things like GitHub, the internet arrived at a time, and open source arrived at the same time through not coincidence, but very specifically. It's sort of the web itself is an open source phenomena, right? The Tim Berners-Lee puts the HTTP spec in the public domain and doesn't try to commercialize it for CERN and makes it available to everybody. And so I think that whole notion of when I was at Aptaros, we used to say, like, why would you want to do isolated development? Why would you want to say only the 10 engineers who work for me have got to be the smartest 10 engineers in the world because they're the only ones who are allowed to write code for our product? Instead of just saying, actually, anybody in the world can write code for our product, right? Because it's an open source project. And I'd bet on everybody else a lot faster than I would bet on just my team if I had a choice between those two options. And I think that model has really been revolutionary. And, a lot of people will tie kind of the whole Web 2.0 or social media thing to that and say it's the same kind of spirit of openness. I think you have to be a little careful about overgeneralizing that because somebody still owns those social media platforms, right? It's not quite the same thing. Mm-hmm. But I think it is interesting that we've moved in a direction of, crowdsourcing and sort of different ways of thinking about production that are largely inspired by open source. Open Science, the Public Library of Science, lots of sort of academic organizations are now making all of their research available and sort of publishing them without cost and in ways that can be remixed and reused. Creative Commons, the whole origin of the Creative Commons license that is inspired directly by open source and by the GPL as a way to allow creatives to share, photography and music and other things with each other. And I think about kind of Creative Commons licensed and remixed stuff that gets shared on SoundCloud and Bandcamp and places like that. That's definitely analogous to open source. I think it's too early to tell where the real business model change will come from that, but for now, it's certainly a lot of fun seeing what cool stuff people make.
You brought this up. You brought up the Linux and the Penguin, and it's pulling my head apart trying to remember what the guy's name was. He was an early leader in the Linux product before it was called Linux and before all the details were linked out. He was just. I remember watching an interview with him where he was just really irritated that people had turned Linux into a capitalist product.
Yeah,
he had entirely meant it to be a socialist product, and I cannot think of his name.
You thinking about Richard Stallman from the Free Software Foundation?
May very well be.
Yeah, so Richard Stallman, so the Free Software Foundation would be mad at me for even calling it open source and would say it's free software, not open source software, because it's about freedom. And that's where the whole free as in beer versus free as in speech comes from, and sort of the notion that the key thing about free software, see, I still want to say open source, the key thing about free software for the Free Software Foundation is the freedom that you as an individual get to exercise over the source code that runs on your machine. So
right.
Instead of a computer that works for Microsoft or a computer that works for Apple that you get to have in your house, but it really works for them, they would say free software is kind of freeing you from that model and lets you own your machine. I'm much more of a pragmatist, and so to me the sort of phrase open source resonates better because it's a more pragmatic approach. It's not that I don't think those freedoms are important. I actually do, and all the code that I write, I prefer to license under GPL, and I think it's a wonderful thing. But I also don't feel like there's something necessarily evil about running closed source software on your machine. I don't think that's an inherent ethical violation. And Richard Stallman would say that. He would say, you're compromising your ethics by running software that you didn't get to see the source code of. And it's true when we look at, sort of NSA wiretapping and all the other stuff that happens in our modern world. The fact that there's a bunch of software running on machines in my house that I haven't been able to see is a little unsettling, right? It would be nice if it were all open source. On the other hand, I'm a pragmatist, and I love my Mac laptop, and I OS 10 is based on Unix, so it's a Unix-like environment for me. So everybody's got to choose how important that free aspect or ideological aspect of it is to them.
Well, and that so just your take on digital currencies. Make this shorter as long as you want, and the open source currencies.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I haven't spent much time in digital currency. You can't currently pay 10 up in Bitcoin. You can't take your paycheck in Bitcoin, so far as I know. You could take your paycheck and convert it to Bitcoin if you wanted. That's your own responsibility, but we're not involved directly in any digital currency. I think it's fascinating as a way of starting to get a sort of post-national regime notion of how people exchange value. So just a fancy way of saying without dealing with national currencies, right? To be able to kind of have a stable currency that's above the level of a single government is a really fascinating thing. To me, that's one of those places where, when Gibson said the future is here, it's just unevenly distributed. That's one of those places where I don't want to be on the cutting edge when it comes to currency and value. That's one of the places where I'm happy to sit back and say, you pioneers all figure it out, and some of you will lose a shitload of money and some of you will make a ton of money. I'm okay with just sort of waiting until there's more stability in that market and I have a better sense of how it's shaking out before I put any money in it. But I do think it's a really fascinating kind of notion. Currency has always been an abstract. The dollar that you hold in your hand is only worth what it is because of the collective hallucination that says that it's worth something, right? So it's always been kind of an abstract thing, and to make those more digital makes perfect sense. I rarely carry cash anymore. I don't go to the bank. It's a relationship we have over a computer. So that bank could be anywhere, and those currency could be anything. It just so happens I'm a little more comfortable with the US dollar at the moment than I am with any of the virtual currencies that I've seen.
Fair enough. So I wanted to know what you've talked about, how you kind of pushed other projects or other organizations and that you were part of and tried to encourage them to accept the open source platform a little bit more. What was it that got you personally involved in open source?
Boy, it's hard to say even when I first encountered the notion. I think I had been involved in kind of bulletin board scene and other kinds of network organizations going back into the mid 90s and even early 90s. I was on the internet from 1990 on, right? Pre-web, dealing with Gopher and Veronica. And there were things called MUDs and MOOs, which were multi-user dungeons or multi-user object-oriented environments. They were kind of early experiments in massive online multiplayer gaming like we have now, but they were textual, right? So you would just be in a telnet session or in what people may know as like an IRC session, interacting with people in some kind of an environment. And I remember just being fascinated by that whole experience and spending time online that way. And thinking, and all of those things we weren't calling them open source, but they were visible and people were collaborating on them, and it wasn't owned by anyone, right? They were under various kinds of public domain-ish licenses. And so I think I was interested in that going back even to then. When I learned web development in the mid-90s, I taught myself Perl and CGI bin because that was how you interacted with a website. That was the only option. This was before ASP and before PHP and before all that stuff existed. And Perl was and is an open source license, right? It's under the artistic license because Larry Wall was that kind of a guy. And so all of how I learned was by viewing the source of other people and copying and modifying and redistributing code that was under licenses that made that appropriate. So it's more accurate to say I had a brief moment of time from probably 2000 to 2004 or 5 where I was actually working on platforms like Interwoven Team Site and Vignette and Documentum that weren't open source, right? Or even ASP or the early precursors to .NET. That was more the thing that was unusual, was that I spent so much time doing that. And then when I sort of discovered WordPress, I discovered the local, actually Barcamp community in Boston. So Barcamp, if you haven't been, is an unconference, right? A bunch of people show up at a venue. They plan the schedule based on who shows up. People who want to speak put their names on a board, and then you have an impromptu conference. And it's all based on sort of this, it's completely egalitarian. There's no difference between the speakers and the attendees. It's just kind of an open thing with just enough structure to make it work. And so I attended the first couple of our camps in Boston, and then helped organize a couple after that, and wanted to give a talk at WordCamp. So I decided to take a plugin that I'd been working on in the WordPress space and just give a talk about how I built it and why and what I was trying to do. And that kind of happened right at the same moment that I was starting to work with this company that was focused on open source. And so I kind of professionally shifted into open source, I guess, around 2006 or so. And for me, in the beginning, that was Drupal and WordPress at the same time. So I was involved in both communities. I've contributed code to both. I've spoken at conferences for both. And that was probably the next 5 years of my life was mostly Drupal and WordPress with a little bit of Sitecore thrown in for good measure, because I was working in agencies that weren't all open source. But to me, it's just always made sense that the web itself is fundamentally built on open source. It's an open source principles and practices and platforms. So why would you want your content management system to be somehow different than the thing the web is made of? It just always made sense to me that that would be how we would, that's how web developers should learn. That's how we share information with each other. It just made sense to me that that would be open source.
That's awesome.
I don't know if I answered your question there, but
yeah, I think you covered it great. You covered it in the first 10 seconds, and then great story. But you did a great job of leading me in my next question, which was going to be about content management systems.
Yep.
And you talk about how you've been very involved in both Drupal and WordPress. And what do you see, not necessarily between the two of them, but certainly between the two of them as well, are there critical differences between the various CMSs on?
Oh, there definitely are. I mean, it's an interesting world. So even what a CMS is becomes kind of a question about which a lot of people have written volumes. And the concept that there's a difference between enterprise content management and sort of simple web publishing tools. There's a big spectrum there. So kind of when I started at a company that at the time was called T-Visions, which later became Molecular, which later became Isobar, which still exists in most of North America as a digital agency. Our content management practice was one of the key areas in the company, because that was when a lot of people were first shifting their websites into content management systems. There were still a lot of clients at that time who had static HTML sites, and not mom and pop shops around the corner, big Fortune 50 and Fortune 100 companies, because the web was early enough, who still hadn't really invested in an infrastructure for content management. And so a tool like Interwoven Team Site, which I now would consider kind of a dinosaur, in 2002 felt really innovative, or 2003 felt really innovative, and felt like, here's a whole different way to think about managing the content that's on your site and setting workflow and permissions and publishing around it, and sort of treating it like a business problem in a very strategic way. And I would put Documentum and FileNet in that same kind of set. So today, fast forward to today, I think you've got in Drupal and WordPress 2 really strong open source offerings that can cover a wide variety of territory, from a very simple individual blog to a relatively static marketing site that occasionally has some changes in it, all the way up to a multi-site instance for a state university system that's going to have thousands of sites in it and millions of users, right? And sort of everything in between. Then you've got a set of commercial offerings that I would say the most common of these days are probably Sitecore and Adobe Adobe Experience Manager, which is formerly the CQ5 product from Day Software, that are more focused on selling to an enterprise marketing team. They're more focused on kind of solving large company business problems. And I think what you end up with is a really interesting field. So WordPress wins on simplicity and ease of use and market share, right? The whole notion that WordPress powers 25% of the web means that if I'm a company and I'm thinking about what's going to run my websites, because it's not really a website anymore, right? Everybody really has networks of sites. If I'm thinking about what's the platform I'm going to run my web infrastructure on, knowing that even in Medellin, Colombia, there's going to be a WordPress meetup and there's going to be a bunch of people getting together to talk about how this platform works, is very compelling, as opposed to Adobe Experience Manager, where there's going to be 100 people in the world who really know how to write code for it, right? And it's going to be much harder to maintain. Drupal, with Acquia being founded in 2008 by Dries, the co-founder of the project, it's as though Automatic in the WordPress space had focused from day one on selling to enterprise clients. WordPress would be a lot more like Drupal. Because Acquia has focused from the very beginning on we're going to bring the power of Drupal to enterprise IT, they act much more like Oracle or Sun or Microsoft. They hire a lot of their sales team out of Oracle. They have a focus on big teams and large-scale development and architectural elegance and sort of the whole Drupal 8 experience, which was a rewrite from Drupal 7 into Drupal 8 that's coming out later this month, was a multi-year project and really involved a lot of heavy engineering development to fundamentally transform the guts of Drupal, and wasn't really, from my perspective, focused on actually adding features end users wanted. It was much more about gearing up to large-scale development teams. So, from my perspective, if you have a development team of 30 engineers that you want to keep busy, Drupal is a fantastic fit, and they will be very powerful and they can do a lot. If you just want to get stuff done and you have a small team and a limited budget, I think WordPress gives you a better bang for the buck, and I think you get the same kind of power ultimately at the end of the day with a much lower learning curve and with much less difficulty. That's not to say that I think Drupal projects can't ultimately be successful. I think they absolutely can, and I have a lot that I've built over the last 5 years that I think are still successful projects, but they just tend... It's a bigger team. It's kind of the difference between an ocean liner and a set of speedboats, right? You might be able to accomplish the same thing, but Drupal really is that kind of battleship mentality. It's big and heavy and capable of doing a lot. It's very powerful, but it's hard to scale it down to the simpler use cases. And I think WordPress has done a better job of having a bigger stretch from the very simple things it can do all the way up through the more complex things it can do. I think it more effectively covers that ground.
Yeah, so I think you've pretty much covered every question we had on CMSs.
Well, I mean, I can talk about CMSs for hours. So in a couple of weeks, I'm actually speaking at the Gilbane conference here in Boston. Gilbane conference is held once a year in Boston and in San Francisco, and it's kind of an enterprise CMS conference. All of the vendors will be there. Acquia will be a major sponsor. Sitecore will be a major sponsor. I'm actually giving a talk on WordPress as an alternative to traditional content management systems. And it's kind of funny, in the WordPress community, people would be like, WordPress as an alternative? WordPress is the dominant platform, right? But in the enterprise world, they don't see it that way. And they think WordPress is just a toy that people build blogs on. And my hope and my goal in speaking there is to point out WordPress won't work for everybody, right? But it probably covers 95% of what it is that you're using these other platforms to do, and at 1/10 of the cost, right? So, or 100th of the cost in some cases. So don't be so quick to dismiss it because 5 years ago you installed it and you didn't think it could do what you wanted. Come back and take a look. It's much different. I end up in conversations with people who are experts in content management systems but don't realize that WordPress has custom content types and has since 2009, right? Since 2.9 or 3.0. I run into people who are experts in content management platforms but don't think that WordPress can do multi-site. And I have to kind of go, where have you been for the last decade or longer, right? Where do you think WordPress.com comes from? There's a lot of gap of understanding about what WordPress is capable of among the enterprise CMS vendors. Similarly, there's a big gap within the WordPress bubble. People don't have any idea what these other platforms are or what they do. There are 30 decent, solid open source CMSs. There are a good 15 that are written in PHP and MySQL. And most of the WordPress developers that I talk to don't even know what they are, right? So to talk to WordPress developers about Easy Publish or Typo3 or even outside the PHP space, things like Hippo or Magnolia that are very popular in Europe, we should know what some of these other platforms are because they're solving some of the same challenges that we are, and we might actually be able to learn something from them. We have a tendency to just kind of say, well, doesn't everybody use WordPress? But the reality is that's not true, right?
Yeah, well, I don't know any of those, but I have the great advantage of being able to say I'm not a developer, and
that helps too. But if we want to take seriously the mission of kind of democratizing publishing, I think it behooves us to sort of look at what are other people using and what are other businesses who could benefit from knowing about WordPress but don't. So I'm a big proponent of kind of evangelizing in your local community And if you're not a developer, maybe that's the business community. Maybe it's talking to other business owners about what you're trying to do and how you use WordPress to do it. And also listening, right? It's not just, let's not just send a bunch of people out in the world to scream about WordPress and not listen. It's also, you got to show up for a conversation. You got to listen and learn too.
Well, not that it's been entirely on topic, but yeah, I'm really excited about this meetup here because predominantly here in Columbia, everything is Joomla.
Yep.
And I am not the biggest fan of Joomla.
Yep.
But I do content strategies and SEO and stuff of that nature. And so when I'm dealing with clients, a lot of times it's how do I get away from this Joomla and to this thing that you're using, this WordPress thing. So,
well, it's funny. Everybody has kind of, I think the psychologists call it presence blindness, right? We see the thing that's near us and not what other people are doing. So, you know, people say, oh, somebody still uses Joomla. Well, there's a huge, vibrant Joomla community. There's a lot of people using it, right? And yet you go to a WordPress conference and they'll be like, well, nobody does that. You go to a .NET conference, right? Sitecore is a .NET CMS from Denmark. And they're like, everybody uses .NET, don't they? I mean, that's what people use for real business. They run everything on .NET, right? And nobody uses Java and nobody uses PHP. That's a toy, right? And then you go to a Java conference for some J2E product and they say, well, nobody really uses PHP, right? And it's this constant, like everybody thinks the thing that they're using is the tool everyone else uses and that nobody uses anything else. And it just feels like a weird thing that we can't step back far enough to say, you know, it's fine for other tools to exist. That's great. Maybe there's something I might learn from those people, even though they're not using my tool, right?
Sure. Yep. Okay. Well, you know, you bring that up, and so you talk about some of the, that's probably one of your buttons on the WordPress community right there. Is how we're so we're inside the echo chamber.
Yeah, I give a talk at WordCamp Philly this year about getting outside the bubble, and you know, we've been within 10 Up pushing a lot of our team to be doing outreach and speaking in the broader PHP community, and then there are other communities where they have an impact and a reach in user experience or in project management or in other kinds of activities. It's amazing to me as a local community organizer in Boston of WordCamp Boston and others, you know, how little overlap I'll see between those groups, between the Boston PHP group and the WordPress meetup. Between the front-end developer meetup that also happens in Boston or the JavaScript meetup that happens in Boston and the WordPress meetup, it's like people pick one thing and they can only handle one group to belong to at a time. And so, yeah, it's definitely a part of my, one of my favorite rants about the WordPress community is like, don't only talk to other WordPress people, get outside your comfort zone sometimes. And I think so partially it's about like, what can we learn from other communities and what can they learn from us? It's also just partially, there's something very cliquish about the WordPress community sometimes. I talked about this actually at WordCamp Ann Arbor. That's too bad Kyle couldn't join us, but they were kind enough to invite me to speak at WordCamp Ann Arbor. And I talked there about sort of the way we define our community. And sometimes there's a little bit of a cult of personality, kind of, oh, those are the important people. The cool kids sit at that table over there, and everybody should know who they are, and everybody should know when they mention an acronym or a track ticket should know exactly what they're talking about. And it can create a feeling that's not very welcoming to newbies, and it can create a feeling that's not very inviting to people we might want to join the community. So I think it's also important not just that we get outside our bubble, but that we make our bubble friendly for people coming in from the outside. And a lot of that just has to do with sort of how we treat each other on Twitter and in blog comments and in Slack and everywhere else. And, you know, let's be real careful to try to have the kind of community we want to have, which means being the kind of community member that you would like other people to be. And sometimes I think our community can miss that and get caught up in the WP drama and in the, you know, nonsense that sometimes happens in a large group.
Excellent. So Kyle does have a couple questions in here that I need to ask you. And they both involve a crystal ball.
Uh-oh.
And what does your crystal ball say about the future of WordPress?
So, you know, it's funny. That was the title of my talk at WordCamp Ann Arbor was The Future of WordPress and your role in it. And part of what I was trying to get across is, you know, the best way to predict the future is to invent it, right? So sort of what happens in the future of WordPress is very much dependent on this kind of collective action by the thousands and millions of people who are in the WordPress community. I think there's a couple of things that we know we'll see. obviously with 4.4 coming out soon, REST API integration, the Fields API project that Scott Kingsley Clark is working on with Helen from Inside 10up. I think we'll continue to see movement in the direction of sort of more complex content structures. So custom post types, but also relationships between them, all the term meta and taxonomy meta work that's been happening is all about increasing WordPress's ability to model complex content. So if you look at, again, the broader CMS community, a lot of the focus has been Karen McGrane's book, Content Strategy for Mobile, Sarah Wachter-Buchter's book called Content Everywhere, are all about sort of content modeling and how you need to have smaller objects modeled in your content system rather than just big giant blobs of posts, right? And so if you want to build a more complex business, maybe you need to have not just one featured image, but 10 different featured images to be used in different contexts to represent something. And a lot of the direction in the community has been around more complexity of content, right? So custom post types are wonderful. They can represent lots of different things, but the more that you start to model those things, the more quickly you get to complexity about relationships between them and potential performance issues with storing so much in the term meta database and all that. I think we'll continue to see lots of movement in that direction of more complexity. I think the REST API, is at the point in its expectations curve where it can't possibly do anything but disappoint a lot of people now, because it's so high on that hype curve, right? And I don't mean to be dismissive about it. I think it's a wonderful thing, and I think it's well overdue, and I'm happy to see it integrated into core. But I think it's not a magic solution to every problem WordPress has ever encountered. And I think what people sometimes miss is there's a lot of value that has been engineered into WordPress's experience over the last 10 years, both from the dashboard side and from the templating side and the front end side, that a lot of people are about to throw away in creating wholly new authoring experiences that take advantage of the REST API, or wholly new front end experiences. And now we can build our entire site in React.js and throw away everything we've learned about HTML and CSS. And I'm not sure that's going to be a step forward for everybody. A lot of that stuff is going to be horrible, frankly, that people build. And we should just be prepared for that, right? And then there'll be some good that'll come out of it as it sort of settles and we figure out what the right ways to use it are and how it's really meaningful and how it's impactful. So I think, we'll continue to grow in market share. I think the 25% announcement that was made recently is a great sign. I think, and 10up has bet its business on at some level, we will continue to see WordPress growing in the enterprise space. There's still always more work to be done than we can possibly do. And I know that's true of many of the other agencies in the WordPress space as well. So, it continues to be more and more large businesses are recognizing the value of building on WordPress as a platform, and I think that'll continue. I think we'll continue to see kind of this question around what I'd call professionalization. So things like credentialing, and should there be a certificate or a credential that you get to be a WordPress developer? And I don't think any of those have easy answers. Drupal never really figured that out either. Acquia flirted with the certification for a while, but I don't think it ever really took. I think it is hard when you meet two different people at a conference who both say they're WordPress developers. They could be miles apart in terms of skill and experience, and you don't really have any good way to recognize that except working with them or looking at their code, right? It's a big undifferentiated community. I think that's good in the sense that it's productive and positive, but it does also make it a little hard to tell the wheat from the chaff, pardon the expression, but to know what's going to be effective. I think we'll continue to see lots of WordPress drama and, customizer changes that everybody freaks out about, and, confusion over commercial plugins and themes and how they fit together with the open source world. And, we'll see developers who build a whole business on top of WordPress but don't really understand the licensing underneath it make stupid pronouncements and get into controversy. But I think that's all okay. I don't think any of that is really a threat to our community. I think if there is a threat to the WordPress community, it's again being too insular and being too self-confident in our 25% number and not paying enough attention to sort of what other people are doing that's interesting.
Nice. Well, so we got 5 minutes left. These are gonna get rough.
All right, I'm prepared.
Who in the community inspires you?
Oh boy. Well, I mean, there are a lot of different people in the community that inspire me in different ways, right? Jake, I have to give kind of first position in that based on kind of what he's done with 10up over the last 4 years plus, almost 5 now for him. You know, Jake and I met back in 2009 organizing WordCamp Boston the first time, and 10up didn't exist yet. And so I knew him as an employee of an agency in Providence. And seeing kind of what he accomplished in a very short period of time. Now I can say what we've accomplished, but really a lot of it happened before I showed up, and a lot of other people helped Jake too, but he found them all and created it all out from scratch. So he takes a lot of the credit there deservedly. I think, you know, I look at the way that Corey Miller thinks about the WordPress community and you know, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go with others mantra that he's talked about many times. I think as a person who sort of operates with high integrity and really is focused on what's good for his team, but also the community in which they operate, that's inspiring. I think you know, I'm always inspired by Aaron Jorbin's talks. So Aaron gave a talk at WordCamp Philadelphia last year called Philosophy-Driven Development that I think is something everybody should watch. And then he gave one at WordCamp New York this year on sort of what the WordPress community can learn from science fiction and sort of what happens in science fiction communities and parallels in the WordPress community. That was great. I think Boone Gorgeous, you know, his talk at WordCamp US last year about sort of working within an open source model and what it means to be kind of an independent, trying to get companies to sponsor you to work on open source and share those things back based on his work with Cooney and other organizations on Commons in a Box. I think that's really inspiring. I don't know, I'm sure there are a million others that I'm not thinking of right now. Every day I'm inspired by things that I see happening in our community. I think the way that the community has come together around, you know, Alex King's passing or other kinds of tragedies that befall the community and come together to create scholarships and sort of opportunities to increase community diversity coming out of some of those kinds of challenges, the Kim Parcells thing. You know, those are really inspirational to me. I think ultimately it comes down to just kind of, you know, it's a cliche, but being the change you want to see in the world. And when I meet and work with people either as part of 10up or outside 10up, just as a person in the WordPress community, who I feel like are really living and living up to that ideal and walking the walk, not just talking the talk, but really, you know, putting their money where their mouth is. That's really inspiring to me.
Okay, yeah, that's awesome. And you brought up a lot of good people, some of we've already had on.
I'm sure I've left out a million too, who I'm going to now think of after the fact, but
we'll give you your own show for that.
It's the end of a long interview, so what can I say?
Hey, you brought up a lot of people. I don't even know that many people in my mind right now. So one more question. How do you prepare for WordCamp presentations?
So that's a good one. I mean, it's interesting because, you know, sometimes people ask me like, do you miss academia, and was that training useful to you as a WordPress person or as a digital agency person? And I think absolutely. So I spent 8 years teaching in a classroom where every day for 3 or 4 hours a day, you were standing in front of 40 to 400 people, taking them through some kind of a topic, right? So a lot of that has been a part of kind of how I think about preparing for a WordCamp. It's pretty traditional, like your high school English teacher would have taught you, right? So I start with an outline. I start with a sense of what's the point I'm trying to get across. I think about what are the points that illustrate that. And I mean, it comes down to the kind of outline you might have written on index cards when you were in debate class or whatever, right? I'm thinking about what I'm trying to say. Then I spend time looking for images. So if you've seen any of my talks, I tend to use kind of imagery that's more abstract and doesn't, it's not a lot of words on slides. I'm not a big fan of a lot of words on slides. I think, there's a lot that people can learn in presentation skills about how to bore an audience to death with, 600 words per slide that you're going to read out loud. So I try to avoid that. And then I practice. It's hard. I don't like to give the same talk multiple times at different conferences. Some people do that, and I understand why, because it's certainly a time saver. And if you have a key point to make, you want to make it in multiple contexts, that makes sense to me. I tend instead to do a given talk at only 1 or 2 or maybe 3 conferences. So what that means is I do a lot of practicing before I get on stage. And then no matter how many times you practiced it, your timing is always different when you're on stage. So, I always also have just learned to kind of adapt and follow the time. And I use presenter display on my laptop so I can sort of see how much time has elapsed, and I know how many slides I have and how fast I need to go, and I can kind of adjust as I go. Every time I give a WordCamp talk, I am convinced about 3 hours before the talk that it's completely useless and a piece of crap and nobody's going to have any idea what I'm talking about. And I have failed miserably and it's going to be horrible. And then I give the talk and I sort of feel like, well, actually that wasn't so bad. It sort of went all right. And I got some interesting questions. And then people come up and talk to you for the next day throughout the rest of the conference or whatever and tell you how much they enjoyed it. And then you feel like, wow, maybe it wasn't that bad. And kind of 3 months later, I can look back at them and think, actually, I'm pretty happy with how that went. But it's a cycle that I've just come to expect. And the night before I'm about to talk, I always have that moment of like, holy crap, I've got to rewrite 50 of my slides because it's not going to make any sense. And that transition doesn't really work. And, I'm not sure that the abstract I submitted really matches anymore what the talk is now. And how much do I need to worry about that? And ultimately, I've just kind of come to say, I need to line up the message that I want to deliver as effectively as I can. And if that doesn't quite match what I submitted 6 months ago, then that's all right. And remind myself that it always actually turns out better than I think it will, right? The disaster that I imagine happening doesn't actually happen. It's kind of an imposter syndrome thing, I guess, at some level, where you just sort of think that I'm going to be found out as a fraud, that I don't really know what I'm talking about. And once you sort of recognize that that's the pattern, then when you see it happening, you can kind of pause and just say, okay, this is the point in the roller coaster where I'm at the bottom of the pit. And I know 4 hours from now, I'll be done giving the talk and it will all be fine. So I can just calm down and breathe and be ready and get in the right headspace. And then it's all fine.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So I think a lot of people who give talks feel that way, right? Like it's not, I don't think that's that unusual. I think it's part of what makes people good at it is they're passionate about it and they have something they really want to say and they want it to be good. And that means they care about it. So therefore they're stressed about it and worried about it. And probably if they didn't care, they would be horrible speakers because they wouldn't really prepare and they wouldn't really spend the time and they wouldn't really go through the process. And then, they'd be horrible.
I almost forgot about it, but early on, you kind of reminded me back when I was in the Army, when I was in the instructor position, I had a rule of at least every 10 minutes, there had to be a very good joke, yes, an explosion, or a video, or just either that or everybody had to go outside and have a smoke break. No more than 10 minutes.
It's true. Humor is important, right? And I mean, I don't like to think of myself as a stand-up comic up there doing a talk, but I do feel like if you've gone 20 minutes and nobody's laughed, we're all taking ourselves too seriously, right? So I do try to kind of, and the obvious are like funny cat gifs or funny videos or whatever, but I think it's important to sort of lighten the mood and sort of let people know it's okay to express themselves.
I think it brings you back in as well. If you start drifting and you start focusing on one aspect, a little humor can, all right, let's get everybody focused back on this. Because, even if I'm listening to a great talk, if somebody like hits a point that I'm like, wow, that was brilliant, I might make a note and I'll think about that and start ignoring the person, even if I'm
especially if it's a 45-minute talk or an hour talk. I mean, that's a long time, right? If it's more like 20 minutes, you can put up with just about anything for 20 minutes. But if it's really long, that can get hard.
Yep. Well, any wrap-up thoughts? Anything we should have asked or should have covered before we?
You didn't ask me if TenUp was hiring, for one, but
we didn't ask you what?
If TenUp is hiring or not.
We've gotten that answer like 600 times now.
Okay, good. I was going to say, usually that's the question we get. Boy, I don't know. What should you have asked me? What do I do when I'm not working in WordPress?
That's a great question. What's the answer?
I don't know. Is there such a thing as not working in WordPress? No. I'm a huge music fan and musician, so I play guitar and hack my way around things and go see live music. I'm a huge fan of seeing bands live, so that's kind of what I cram into my time when I can. Or I take my dogs to the beach with my wife and go walk around and look at the Atlantic Ocean, and otherwise I guess watch movies. I don't know. We're pretty laid back, pretty quiet, not doing anything. I'm not out skydiving or racing cars or anything.
So much for those NASCAR dreams, right?
Yeah, we're pretty mellow.
All right. Well, yeah, if you don't have anything else you want to share with the world,
I'm good.
We'll wrap it up here then. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And I know the other guys are really upset they couldn't join, but they'll be forced to write a book report on, or a report on the video here, and to prove that they
say there'll be a pop quiz tomorrow for those who are not paying attention. Yeah.
They're going to be doing the show notes.
That's good.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.